Thank you for watching Amir Shakil 5858. I am Amir Putnam. I am thankful to all news resources. Following are the news which have been reported by American, European and Canadian channels. African, Asian channels and all news agencies have reported the same news. U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Texas police can arrest illegal immigrants. Differences between Mr. Biden and Netanyahu causing famine in Gaza. Inflation cooling in Canada. Canada's air quality is bad than U.S. Canadian Palestinians in Gaza. Kate goes to shopping. Russians will participate in Olympic Games, but not social media influencer effect on American election this year. Mr. Biden in election campaign. Trump's new controversial remarks about Jews, voters of Democrats. Negotiations to avoid partial shutdown of U.S. government. Former aide of Mr. Trump reported to Miami prison. Police torture in Mississippi. Defense Secretary Mr. Austin pledged support to Ukraine. Security law in Hong Kong for dissenters. Former Brazil president facing indictment. $230 billion profit by forced labor. Electrical vehicle and emission law. On Wall Street, Dow Jones increased, S&P 500 increased, and Nasdaq also increased. Now the news in detail.
Nine of Oz. On the NewsHour tonight, an immigration ruling from the Supreme Court means Texas police can now arrest and deport migrants.
Experts warn of famine in Gaza as a rift opens between Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Biden White House.
And how influencers on social media are playing an outsized role in this presidential election.
A lot of people are persuaded daily by stuff on TikTok. They'll see a clip of Biden or Trump saying something, and that'll change their minds.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by...
These are people who are trying to change the world. Startups have this energy that energizes me. I'm thriving by helping others every day. People who know BDO.
The ongoing support of these individuals and institutions, and friends of the NewsHour, including Kathy and Paul Anderson, and Camilla and George Smith.
The John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, fostering informed and engaged communities. More at kf.org.
And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the NewsHour. The U.S. Supreme Court has cleared the way for Texas to enforce a controversial immigration law for now. The law allows state officials to arrest and deport migrants suspected of crossing the border illegally.
The three liberal justices dissented, with Justice Sonia Sotomayor warning, quote, "The court gives a green light to a law that will upend the long-standing federal-state balance of power and sow chaos." Challenges to the law are not over as the justices sent the case back to a lower court. NewsHour Supreme Court analyst Marsha Coyle has been following the decision and joins us now. Marsha, it's great to see you. So the Supreme Court will allow Texas to enforce for now this contentious new law that gives local police the authority to arrest migrants. How did the justices arrive at this ruling?
First of all, Jeff, it appears to be a 6-3 decision not to grant the Biden administration a temporary pause on the law taking effect. The only one who wrote in the majority was Justice Barrett, and she was joined by Justice Kavanaugh. And her bottom line seems to be that it is premature for the Supreme Court to act on the administration's request at this time, while the lower federal appellate court, the Fifth Circuit, still had before it the question of whether to pause the law while an appeal goes forward in that Fifth Circuit.
So this law now goes into effect as the litigation continues in the lower courts. What happens next? What are the implications?
Okay, well, first of all, the lower federal appellate court, I believe, has scheduled arguments for the first week in April on whether it should pause the law while an appeal goes forward. But with the law would immediately take effect now, and Texas will begin to implement it. It, as you said, allows law enforcement officials to arrest undocumented immigrants who cross the border illegally, allows them to deport them to Mexico. State judges can make the deportations. It is quite a departure from what federal law has historically given the responsibility to the federal government. Texas, on the other hand, claims that its law mirrors the federal law and that many states cooperate.
That is NewsHour Supreme Court analyst Marsha Coyle. Marsha, thanks as always.
My pleasure, Jeff.
In the day's other headlines, President Biden kicked off a 3-day swing across the West with a focus on winning Latino voters. He stopped first in Reno, Nevada to meet with volunteers before heading to Las Vegas, then to Phoenix, Arizona, and finally to Dallas and Houston in Texas. In the meantime, former President Trump stirred new outrage for saying Jewish voters who support Democrats hate Israel and Judaism. The nation's top Jewish elected official, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, called it, quote, unadulterated anti-Semitism. Both candidates have clinched their presidential nominations, but other races are getting attention tonight in the latest primaries. Republicans in Ohio are picking a candidate to try to pick up a U.S. Senate seat. And in heavily Democratic Chicago, voters are choosing a nominee for the nation's second-largest prosecutor's office. The winner is all but assured of election in November. Congressional negotiators work today to flesh out spending bills needed to avert a partial government shutdown this weekend. They agreed overnight on the overall package, covering the Pentagon, Homeland Security, and other departments. Senate leaders welcomed the deal, but said time is running out.
There's a lot of work to do in the coming days. If both parties proceed in the same manner we did 2 weeks ago, quickly, constructively, and without unnecessary partisan dithering, then I'm hopeful we can finish the appropriations process without causing a lapse in government services.
The spending bills are the final ones needed to fund the government for the rest of the fiscal year. Former Trump trade advisor Peter Navarro reported to federal prison today in Miami. He's to serve 4 months for refusing to cooperate with the congressional January 6th investigation. Navarro condemned the justice system today at a news conference. Then he was driven into the prison complex, and officials confirmed he's now in custody. In Mississippi, 2 former sheriff's deputies were sentenced in the racist torture of 2 black men. One defendant got 20 years in federal prison, the other got more than 17 years. In all, 6 former officers admitted to their roles in sexually and physically abusing the victims. Several belong to a group known as the Goon Squad. The sentencings continue tomorrow and Thursday. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin insisted today that Washington remain committed to Ukraine's war effort despite a funding stalemate in Congress. Austin joined counterparts from Europe and other nations at a meeting in Germany. Later, he said, quote, "The United States will not let Ukraine fail."
I leave here today fully determined to keep U.S. security assistance and ammunition flowing. And that's a matter of survival and sovereignty for Ukraine. And it's a matter of honor and security for America. And make no mistake, Putin is watching, the world is watching, and history is watching.
Last week, the Pentagon sent its first military aid to Ukraine since December after finding cost savings in other accounts. In Hong Kong today, lawmakers unanimously approved a national security law that grants the government even more power to crack down on dissent. The legislature, stacked with pro-China loyalists, had fast-tracked the measure. It expands on a similar law that's been used to prosecute pro-democracy activists since 2020. Former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro is facing the first of what may be multiple indictments, this one for falsifying his COVID vaccination status. The far-right leader had openly flouted health restrictions during the pandemic. Under Brazil's legal system, today's indictment allows actual charges to be filed. The United Nations International Labor Organization reports that illegal profits from forced labor have skyrocketed to $236 billion per year. The agency finds there was a 37% increase in 2021 from a decade earlier. It also found sexual exploitation accounts for 3/4 of the illicit profits. Back in this country, the Biden administration is easing its drive for more electric vehicles. The Energy Department granted higher mileage ratings for EVs today. That makes it easier for automakers to meet higher fuel economy mandates. And reports said the EPA will relax its timetable for tailpipe emission cuts. The plan relies heavily on EV sales, but demand for the vehicles has slowed. And on Wall Street, stocks advanced again today ahead of tomorrow's Federal Reserve announcement on interest rates. The Dow Jones Industrial Average gained 320 points to close at 39,110. The Nasdaq rose 63 points. The S&P 500 added 29. Still to come on the NewsHour, President Biden's plans to counter the spiking cost of housing. What's causing the record-breaking rise in ocean temperatures? Why many Americans from white evangelical backgrounds are choosing to leave the church. And a new exhibit celebrates the impact and legacy of the Harlem Renaissance.
This is the PBS NewsHour from WETA Studios in Washington and in the West from the Walter Cronkite.
Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Famine is imminent in northern Gaza, according to a UN-backed report published Monday. Michael Fakhri, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, said the U.S. is, quote, complicit in the starvation of the Palestinian people in Gaza, and urged the Biden administration to call for a ceasefire and stop sending weapons and money to Israel. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and UNRWA Chief Philippe Lazzarini also blasted what they call the man-made hunger crisis Monday. This is EU's top diplomat, Josep Borrell.
This famine is not a natural disaster. It's not a flood. It's not a earthquake. It's entirely man-made. I'm coming from Washington, and I dare to say, well, yes, Israel is provoking famine.
Borrell added, quote, before the war, Gaza was the greatest open-air prison. Today, it's the greatest open-air graveyard, he said. The European Union Monday approved sanctions against violent Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank and against Hamas. The White House says President Biden told Benjamin Netanyahu Israel should not invade Rafah during a Monday phone call, as the Israeli Prime Minister reportedly agreed to send a team of Israeli officials to Washington to discuss an alternative approach. But the Palestinian Foreign Ministry says Israel has already begun its large-scale attack on Rafah without announcing it, as Israeli forces escalate their bombardment of the once so-called safe zone, where some 1.5 million Palestinians have taken shelter. Earlier today, Israeli strikes killed at least 14 people in Rafah and injured dozens of others.
We're in Ramadan. People have suhoor to prepare for the fast, but we're having suhoor over body remains, blood and martyrs. There's US support, European support, and support of the whole world to Israel. They support them with weapons and planes, with continuing planes. They mock us and send 4 or 5 airdrops just to save face.
Close to 32,000 Palestinians have been killed by Israel since October 7th, according to the latest official numbers. 74,000 others have been injured. The police general tasked with coordinating the entry of aid trucks into northern Gaza was killed by Israeli forces during their raid on the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza City on Monday. Faik Mabhou recently helped secure the arrival of food aid for 2 nights in a row after weeks of Israeli blockade. Meanwhile, Al Jazeera journalist Ismail Al-Ghul, who was arrested and beaten during the Al-Shifa raid, was released after 12 hours of detention. While in Israeli custody, Al-Ghul said he and other journalists were forced to strip naked, lie on their stomachs for hours in the cold while blindfolded with their hands tied. In the occupied West Bank, Israeli forces arrested journalist Rula Hassanein and raided her home overnight. She has a 9-month-old baby she was forced to leave behind despite still breastfeeding. In related news, a 26-year-old Palestinian Bedouin detained in an Israeli prison died over the weekend amidst reports of rampant abuse and medical neglect in Israeli jails. Juma Abu Ghanima is at least the 13th person to die from mistreatment in an Israeli prison since October 7th. In Haiti, at least a dozen people were killed as armed groups attacked 2 upscale neighborhoods in the capital Port-au-Prince Monday. The communities of La Boule and Thomasin had remained relatively untouched by worsening violence and turmoil in Haiti. Residents described the chaotic scene early Monday.
Last night around 11 p.m., when we were sitting here, 2 young boys suddenly appeared and opened fire on several of our brothers. They didn't address anyone. They just came out and started shooting. They didn't ask any questions. I was there when the shooting happened, and I saw them get out of a car and start shooting. I was trying to understand the situation.
Last week, unelected Haitian Prime Minister Ariel Henry announced he'll resign after a coalition of armed groups opposing his rule declared an uprising. Meanwhile, Haitian stakeholders and leaders of the Caribbean Community, or CARICOM, are still in negotiations to establish a transitional presidential council in Haiti. In Nigeria, armed groups kidnapped at least 100 people, including children, in 2 separate attacks in Kaduna State in the north. The mass abduction is the latest attack following the separate kidnapping of nearly 300 students and staff from a school in the northwestern town of Kuriga earlier this month. Abductions in Nigeria have become more frequent in recent years as armed groups target residents for large ransoms. In Gambia, the National Assembly voted to repeal a landmark 2015 ban on female genital cutting, also known as female genital mutilation. If approved, it would be the first reversal of protections against the practice, which causes long-term health effects, including increased risks of complications during pregnancy and childbirth. Less than 10% of the National Assembly's members are women. This is Amnesty International researcher Michelle Echen.
It simply will be disastrous for women's rights, not only in Gambia, but in the region. It will tell young girls, your rights can be easily taken away. If this is passed, then what's next? We have to really be strong about it and make sure that we don't take away something that took so long to fight for.
Schools in South Sudan have temporarily shuttered in preparation for a scorching heat wave that's expected to last for the next 2 weeks. Officials have advised children to stay indoors as temperatures are likely to reach 113 degrees Fahrenheit. Extreme heat waves have become more common in South Sudan due to the worsening climate crisis and has compounded an already dire humanitarian crisis due to conflict in the region. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has expressed concerns at reports the Burmese military is continuing to bomb civilian areas. Dozens of people reportedly killed, including children, early Monday in Burmese military airstrikes on a predominantly Rohingya village in Rakhine State. Clashes in the region soared after the end of the ceasefire in November between the Arakan army and Burmese forces that have been in place since 2021 military coup. Guterres said, quote, the expansion of conflict is driving displacement and exacerbating pre-existing vulnerabilities and discrimination. In Syria, some 30,000 children and women who had ties to Islamic State militants are still being detained in camps and prisons across North Syria under severely abusive conditions. That's according to a UN-backed commission, which says most of the children were brought to the camps a decade ago when the Islamic State controlled portions of land in the region. It's been 5 years since the militant group lost its presence in Syria, but the children have yet to be repatriated to their home countries, remaining in indefinite captivity. Tens of thousands of people, many of them children under the age of 12, and women who are married to Islamic State militants, are being held at Al-Hol camp, which has been described by the UN as a, quote, blight on the conscience of humanity. Dozens of babies are reportedly born each month at Al-Hol, which is located in a region of northwestern Syria still patrolled by hundreds of U.S. troops. Meanwhile, teenage boys are kept in jails that are run by the U.S.-backed Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces. In Argentina, protesters in Buenos Aires were met with riot police and tear gas Monday as they marched in a union-led rally to protest mounting food insecurity and far-right President Javier Milei's massive cuts to social spending. This is union leader Hugo Godoy.
Today we came back to march together to demand the government once again respond to this worsening situation of the food crisis that over 6 million Argentinians suffer from. The government doesn't even have an inch of humanity to guarantee food provisions to soup kitchens. It's as if they enjoyed the people's pain.
The protest took place days after Argentine senators dealt a major blow to President Javier Milei's so-called economic shock therapy agenda, voting to block his sweeping decree. Since taking office, Milei has imposed over 300 austerity and deregulation measures. He also cracked down on the right to protest. Argentina has the highest inflation rate in the world, even as it slowed down to 13% last month, down from 20% in January. UNICEF's warned children are suffering some of the worst effects of the current economic crisis, and Milei's cost-cutting measures with a child poverty rate that could soon hit 70%. Back in the United States, Donald Trump's failed to secure the $454 million bond for his New York civil fraud case, increasing the likelihood New York Attorney General Letitia James will seize his real estate assets. Trump's lawyer said their client was turned down by around 30 bond underwriting companies. The lawyers are requesting the former president be allowed to delay posting bond while he appeals the case. If their request is denied, Letitia James could start seizing Trump's properties on Monday. In other Trump news, former White House aide Peter Navarro is expected to turn himself into a federal prison in Miami today to serve his 4-month sentence for contempt of Congress. Navarro will become the first ever ex-White House official to serve time for a contempt of Congress conviction after he refused to comply with a subpoena from the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th Capitol insurrection. The U.S. Supreme Court Monday heard arguments in 2 First Amendment cases. The National Rifle Association is accusing a New York State official of threatening insurance companies in order to get them to cut ties with the NRA. In another case, conservative states and social media users allege the federal government overstepped when it put pressure on social media companies to moderate misinformation around COVID-19 and the 2020 election. The justices appeared skeptical of efforts to limit the Biden administration's contact with social media companies. This is Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson.
So I guess some might say that the government actually has a duty to take steps to protect the citizens of this country, and you seem to be suggesting that that duty cannot manifest itself in the government encouraging or even pressuring platforms to take down harmful information. So can you help me? Because I'm really worried about that because you've got the First Amendment operating in an environment of threatening circumstances from the government's perspective, and you're saying that the government can't interact with the source of those problems.
And the Environmental Protection Agency announced a total ban on asbestos. The carcinogen had been largely prohibited in previous environmental orders, but chrysotile asbestos had been permitted until this latest ban and is used in a range of products including brake linings, gaskets, and in chlorine bleach and sodium hydroxide production. It's been found to cause lung cancer, mesothelioma, and other cancers, and is linked to over 40,000 U.S. deaths each year. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
A ground offensive in Rafah without a clear plan would be a disaster. Words from the U.S. State Department as Israeli Prime Minister remains determined to push into the southern city of Gaza. A potential ground operation would set back the ceasefire talks taking place in Qatar. Ukraine's survival is in danger with Russia making new gains on the eastern front line. Kyiv is running out of ammunition whilst the Kremlin continues to get supplies from Iran and from North Korea. Ukraine calls for help to boost its aerial defenses. Slamming this as election interference, witch hunt, and a corrupt system. Donald Trump takes to his Truth Social account after being refused a bond during his appeal. If unable to pay near $500 million by Monday, the New York Attorney General can proceed to collect it. Hello, welcome back to the France 24 newsroom. Despite Joe Biden's warnings, the Israeli Prime Minister remains determined to carry out the ground offensive in Rafah. More than half of Gaza's 2.3 million people are sheltering in the southern city of the enclave in dire humanitarian conditions. Over 130 hostages are thought to be held in Gaza, and Benjamin Netanyahu has sworn to eradicate Hamas and bring back home those detained. The White House says that there will be meeting early next week in Washington to find alternatives to the operation in Rafah, whilst in Qatar, ceasefire talks are underway, where officials say to be cautiously optimistic, although the Qatari Foreign Ministry spokesperson stressed that the planned ground offensive in Rafah would set back any talks.
Rafah is home to 1.4 million people, many of whom were pushed out of their homes in northern Gaza by Israel's ground operations there. The displaced are fearing the same fate again, as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu insists he's pushing forward with plans for an assault on Rafah, this despite pleas from Washington for the whole thing to be called off.
I made it clear to the President that we are determined to complete the elimination of these battalions in Rafah, and there is no way to do it other than the ground invasion.
Netanyahu's comments come less than a day after Biden cautioned against a ground invasion in a call with the Israeli leader. Washington says such a move would be a mistake, and that Israel could achieve its military aims, namely rooting out Hamas operatives, by other means. The White House is set to reiterate those calls in a meeting early next week between US and Israeli officials. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has joined the chorus of opposition. She says military action could have even more catastrophic consequences for civilians. Qatar, a key mediator in ongoing ceasefire talks, fears the operation would also set negotiations back.
I do believe, of course, and we have said this countless times, that any attack on Rafah would hamper any efforts to get a deal. It would be a humanitarian catastrophe within what is happening right now in Gaza. We are talking about around 1.5 million Palestinians crammed into 10% of Gaza. We already...
Despite those warnings, Qatari officials say they are cautiously optimistic following a meeting with Israel's intelligence chief to secure a 6-week truce.
Well, the latest IDF strikes have killed at least 19 people in the Nusrat refugee camp situated in the centre of the enclave. Among those killed are 5 women and 9 children, according to the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital, where their bodies were brought in. More than 31,800 Palestinians have been killed since the offensive. That was over 5 months ago. Meanwhile, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says now that everyone in Gaza is in need of humanitarian aid. In other world news, Russia says it's made new gains on the front line in eastern Ukraine. The defense ministry claims its troops are now in control of the town of Olivivka in the Donetsk region, which it confirmed means it's expanding its control from the city of Avdiivka, which was captured last month after fierce battles. On top of the ground offensive, the aerial attacks on Ukraine's border regions are intensifying. Kyiv is continuing to respond with its own cross-border drone strikes, but says it needs help to boost its aerial defenses. Siobhan Silk has more.
Dealing with the aftermath of a Russian strike is by now a regular duty for Ukrainian troops in Selidove in the eastern Donetsk region. In recent weeks, the town has come under repeated missile attack.
It was very, very loud. All the windows were blown out. There is not a single window in the whole house. All were blown out. The roof was also blown away.
Selidove is close to the front line, just 30 kilometres west of Orlivka, which Russia says is the latest town to fall under its control. Ukraine's border regions have been enduring what President Volodymyr Zelensky calls constant terrorist attacks.
The Russian army is simply trying to burn our border villages to the ground. Just from the beginning of this march until today, the Russian Air Force has already dropped almost 200 guided bombs on the communities of Sumy region alone.
Under the escalating strikes, Ukraine has been evacuating border regions, including Sumy, while just on the other side of the frontier, Russia says it will begin evacuating 9,000 children from the Belgorod region. It's been hit by a wave of cross-border drone attacks, mostly targeting fuel depots and other infrastructure, but also hitting civilian sites, which Russian President Vladimir Putin calls terrorist methods.
These are shellings of peaceful cities, attempts on the lives of government officials and public figures, attempt to recruit perpetrators of sabotage and terrorist attacks on critical Russian infrastructure facilities and in places with large numbers of people.
Putin accuses Ukraine of acting under direct orders from Western allies. Ukraine's defense minister says what's happening in Belgorod is a direct consequence of Russia's aggression.
The International Olympics Committee has announced that Russian and Belarusian athletes will compete in this summer's Olympics in Paris under a neutral flag but will not take part in the opening ceremony. The IOC explained they would be excluded because they are competing as individual athletes. However, they would get the chance to experience the event. Sina Sykes explains.
They'll be competing under a neutral flag, but no one will be flying it at the Olympics opening ceremony. The International Olympics Committee has excluded Russian and Belarusian athletes from taking part in the event, which will see delegations from across the world travel on boats down the River Seine.
AINs will not participate in the parade of delegations teams during the opening ceremony, since they are individual athletes, but an opportunity will be provided to them to experience the event.
After the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Russian and Belarusian athletes were widely banned from international sports, but the IOC has said that those who qualify for the Games can compete without flags, emblems or anthems of their country. Athletes granted neutral status have to pass a vetting procedure. Russia sent 335 athletes to the Tokyo Olympics in 2021, winning 20 golds out of a total of 71 medals. But only dozens are expected in Paris this summer, with athletes banned from team sports.
Our experts currently project that under the most likely scenario, 36 AINs with a Russian passport and 22 AINs with a Belarusian passport will qualify for the Olympic Games.
So far, 20 athletes with a Russian passport and 7 from Belarus have qualified for Paris 2024. But many more will be expected at Russia's own sporting event, the World Friendship Games, this September, which the IOC has denounced as a cynical attempt by Moscow to politicize sports.
This is the most costly legal battle to date for Donald Trump. The former US president owes the state in a civil fraud lawsuit nearly $500 million. And if the Republican presidential nominee doesn't come up with a financial guarantee by Monday, that's the 25th of March, then New York's Attorney General can start the process of collecting wherever possible. Trump's lawyers have asked the court to delay.
It's crunch time for Donald Trump. The former US president has less than 1 week to secure an appeal bond of $464 million in his civil fraud case, after a New York judge ruled that he had fraudulently inflated the value of his assets to obtain favorable loan terms. Though his lawyers have admitted the tycoon doesn't have the cash needed for collateral, and that 30 bond companies have turned him down, including one that Trump had previously misled. In a court filing, Trump's legal team said that a bond in the judgment's full amount is a practical impossibility. Trump, who says he's worth several $billions, was able to post a $91.6 million bond in a defamation case that he lost to the writer E. Jean Carroll last year. But the bond needed for this case is much bigger. Such a large amount is rarely issued, especially for one individual, according to Trump's lawyers. The bond is due on the 25th of March. If Trump cannot produce it by then, he faces possible financial disaster and humiliation. New York's Attorney General, who brought the fraud case, would be entitled to collect the $464 million, which could see Trump's marquee property seized and his bank accounts frozen.
Havana has branded the US Embassy's comments urging the government to respect the human rights of protesters on the island of interventionists. Cuba saw rare mass protests over the weekend demanding for the government to do more to solve recurring blackouts and food shortages. The government has accused the US of being behind the protests, but Washington has rejected the allegations. Yinko Yatadi has a story.
Shopping or taking a walk with your baby in total darkness. On the streets of Havana, only headlights offer a chance to see. Frequent power cuts coupled with food shortages have pushed people out into the streets in rare mass protests. This was one of 5 demonstrations held in the Cuban capital over the weekend, the largest since the anti-government protests of 2021. Cuban leaders say they understand the frustration.
If you have 6, 10, 12 hours of blackouts or interruption in electricity, it is logical for people to protest. If you have that, there should be no surprise for having people protest.
President Miguel Diaz-Canel blames the current unrest on Cuba's longtime enemy, the US, alleging it orchestrated the gatherings. The Cuban leader believes Washington is trying to overthrow the island's communist regime, accusations that the US State Department categorically denies.
The United States is not behind these protests in Cuba, and the accusation of that is absurd.
It's impossible to know how many Cubans live below the poverty line, as the government has chosen to not publish statistics. One thing is certain, food is in short supply. In February, the government announced it could no longer produce enough bread for the entire population.
Finally, John Lee, Hong Kong's city leader, called the new security law coming into effect Saturday a historic moment for the region. Lawmakers passed the bill unanimously, known as Article 23. The package could punish those condemned for treason and insurrection to life imprisonment and up to 20 years for the theft of state secrets. The US has voiced alarm over the national legislation's passage into law, saying it will damage the rights and freedoms of people there.
A swift passage for Article 23, a new bill granting Hong Kong authorities yet more power to quash dissent. The Legislative Council, now full of Beijing loyalists following a recent electoral overhaul, voted unanimously for the bill, after Hong Kong leader John Lee called for it to be pushed through at full speed.
Today is a historic moment for Hong Kong. The Safeguard National Security Ordinance will officially take effect on March 23, 2024.
It comes on top of a similar law imposed by Beijing in the wake of the mass protests for democracy that broke out in 2019. The 2020 National Security Law made a wider range of protest acts illegal and handed power to the Chinese government over how Hong Kong law should be interpreted. Dozens of pro-democracy activists involved in the 2019 movement have already been detained and charged. The new law punishes treason, the theft of state secrets, and espionage, with sentences of up to life imprisonment.
After the 2019 anti-government protests, Hong Kong society has paid a heavy price. Hong Kong people are aware of the importance of national security. There has been a consensus on the need to introduce the domestic national security legislation as soon as possible.
Critics, including the US government, say the law will further narrow freedoms, while the UN called it a regressive step.
That's it from me. You're up to date with the latest. Stay tuned to France 24. More news coming up very shortly.
Inflation is cooling this Tuesday night. What could help keep consumer prices down and fresh hopes for an interest rate cut?
What really helped the economy recover?
Smoke and fears, BC's early warning about wildfires, and how Canada's air quality rates worse than the US. What happened to Canada's promise to get relatives out of Gaza to Canada?
Death is all around him.
And Kate goes shopping,
Which will be nearly 4 months out of the public eye.
Is this glimpse of the princess quelling conspiracy theories?
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. There's a bit of good news about the cost of living in Canada. The rate of inflation dipped last month, and though the cost of big things like rent and mortgages are still high, there are some positive economic signs. Here's a snapshot. Canada's annual rate of inflation slowed to 2.8% in February. That's down slightly from 2.9% in January. It is the first time since early 2021 inflation has been in the Bank of Canada's target range for 2 consecutive months. In our top story, Anne Gaviola looks at what's behind that and what it could mean for interest rates.
All those interest rate hikes have helped cool the economy.
Consumers in Canada have been pulling back their spending on a lot of things, and that lack of demand is not enabling businesses to raise prices as much as they had been in the past.
Reflected in some lower prices in February. New cell phone plans plunged 26%. Clothing and footwear prices were down more than 4%. Airfares tumbled more than 5%. and it was the first month grocery food inflation was below overall inflation since October 2021, coming in at 2.4%. Economists say dampening consumer inflation expectations can help tame future price increases.
They see that grocery prices are not going up as quickly anymore. They see discounts and deals back in store, perhaps keeping control inflation expectations by consumers. And that in turn has helped inflation stay in moderation.
The proverbial thorn in the Bank of Canada's side, shelter costs. Mortgage costs remain stubbornly high, up 26% year over year, and rent inflation continues to soar. The Bank of Canada is widely expected to hold its benchmark interest rate at 5% in April, but with the economy flatlining, a cut by mid-year may be on the table.
A rate cut in June or sooner rather than later would really help the economy recover.
Energy prices may be the wild card. We're about to switch to summer gas, which is more expensive. Supply will also tighten as some refineries go offline for maintenance, while demand picks up with warming weather.
I would expect broadly gas prices to likely continue rising in much of Canada through potentially Victoria Day before we start to see some improvement.
Anne is with me from Toronto, and rent and mortgage interest costs continue to be the main drivers of inflation and, of course, the major expense for most Canadians. Are there any signals about what's coming for those? If you carve out those shelter costs, the Bank of Canada has already met its inflation target. But they're a huge challenge. Soaring demand has juiced rents across the country, and there are no signs that's letting up. And mortgage costs will come down if the central bank cuts interest rates. But as recent polling and history suggest, a clear sign will likely fire up the housing market and boost prices and activity. It is a conundrum. Donna? Interesting, Anne Gaviola in Toronto, thanks. Canadians have begun paying their last respects to former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. His casket, draped in the Canadian flag, was carried by Mounties into the Sir John A. Macdonald building in Ottawa this morning. It's there that he will lie in state opposite Parliament Hill today and tomorrow. Mackenzie Gray has been speaking to people about why they wanted to pay tribute.
We're here today to honor the brilliant legacy of a great statesman.
We're going to miss him. He made an extraordinary difference for my community, but for the entire country.
Brian Mulroney's family greeting hundreds, including another former resident of 24 Sussex who served in Mulroney's cabinet. Joe Clark, Mulroney's external affairs minister, was central in their fight against apartheid in South Africa.
When you think back on it, for anyone to win two majority governments is remarkable. But then to have applied that capacity to so transform the country is really a tribute to his stamina.
But it wasn't just VIPs. A steady stream of Canadians came to remember the 18th Prime Minister.
I'm an immigrant to this country, and it is those forebears who have provided opportunities for people like us to be here.
The first person in line, one of Mulroney's former RCMP security officers.
I was strictly there to provide security, not to advise him in any way in his politics. Not necessarily in favor of a lot of what he did, but also in favor of some of the stuff he did.
Obviously, I didn't always succeed.
Mulroney did leave office deeply unpopular, and it was years before the Conservative Party recovered. Despite 13 years of Liberal rule after Mulroney, former Conservative leader Aaron O'Toole praised the former Prime Minister for making tough decisions on GST and free trade.
The economy we have today really was set in motion almost 40 years ago by Brian Mulroney.
Mulroney will continue to lie in state here in Ottawa tomorrow, in advance of his casket going to Montreal, Donna, before a state funeral on Saturday.
All right, Mackenzie Gray in Ottawa, thanks. There's a dire projection of what's coming in Gaza. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights says Israeli restrictions on the entry of aid may amount to starvation as a method of war, which is a war crime. And the U.S. Secretary of State said today no other place in the world is suffering the way Gaza is, where 2 million people don't have enough to eat.
100% of the population in Gaza is at severe levels of acute food insecurity. That's the first time an entire population has been so classified.
Acute food insecurity is when a person's inability to find adequate food puts their life or livelihood in immediate danger. It is the strongest statement yet from the U.S. on the scale of the crisis.
100%, the totality of the population, is in need of humanitarian assistance. Compare that to Sudan, about 80% of the population there is in need of humanitarian assistance. Afghanistan, about 70%. So again, this only underscores both the urgency, the imperative of making this the priority.
It's been more than 2 months since Canada's government launched a temporary visa program allowing Canadians with loved ones in Gaza to apply to bring them here. One Calgary man is trying to save his sister and her 4 young children, but he tells Heather Yurix West Canada's visa process has stalled.
Born in terrible conditions inside a Rafah tent, Tamar Jarada's 1-month-old nephew is fighting to survive.
Adam now is in the hospital because of infections.
Welcome to Uridu. The number you are calling is currently unreachable.
It's the message Jarada hears most days when he tries to call Gaza. The last time he spoke with his sister, it was a harrowing call.
As always, she was crying, begging for help, and I was hearing the bombs around her tent in Rafah. And her kids being scared.
The family has already been devastated by loss. Last October, an airstrike killed 17 family members, including Jarada's mom, dad, and 2 sisters. It's why the Calgary cancer researcher is now desperate to get his surviving sister and her family, along with his in-laws, to Canada. 16 of 18 family members have received initial approval for special temporary visas, and yet, in Rafah, they remain. According to Ottawa, there have been 986 applications for visas from Gaza, but among those who passed preliminary eligibility, only 14 have left the region to complete the necessary biometric step in Egypt, and each one did so on their own.
We obviously would prefer a more reliable way of getting a lot more people out, but I'm not going to blame people for shaking their lives in their hands and taking extraordinary measures to save their own people.
It's why Jarada is now looking to Egyptian operatives for help and turning online to crowdfunding to try and raise the staggering $160,000 required.
My biggest fear right now is that I won't be able to talk to my sister tomorrow.
For a grieving and terrified family desperate to bring their loved ones to safety, this, it seems, is the only option they have left. Heather Yurix West, Global News, Calgary.
There's more fallout tonight from the passing of a watered-down NDP motion on Palestinian statehood in the House of Commons Monday. Liberal MP Anthony Housefather, one of 3 Liberals who voted against the motion, says he's considering his future in the party.
I started reflecting as to whether or not I belonged, and I will let you know further how I feel over the coming days. For the moment, I'm still there.
The motion passed, but not until after the Liberals drastically altered its wording to say the government will work towards recognizing a Palestinian state as part of a 2-state solution. Housefather says there was not enough recognition of what he calls the existential threat Israel faces and the fears of Jewish Canadians.
We've long prided ourselves on pristine air quality in Canada, but that is an outdated notion. A new report shows for the first time on record, Canada's air quality was worse than the US in 2023. In its 6th annual World Air Quality Report, Swiss-based IQ Air named Canada the most polluted country in North America. And of the 15 most polluted cities in Canada and the US, 14 were in Canada. Most of them in the West. That's where wildfires burned the largest swaths of land. As Neetu Garcha reports, people in BC are already being warned to prepare for what could be another fiery and hot year.
With the sun shining bright on the cusp of spring, the season's promise of renewal is overshadowed by fears of drought and scorching heat, setting the stage for what could be another devastating wildfire season.
This is the earliest that we have begun press conferences cautioning British Columbians about the summer season.
With last year's wildfire season the most destructive on record, she's encouraging British Columbians to have an emergency plan in place.
Register for emergency support services but online now before the emergency actually happens so that you're ready to go and able to receive support if you need it.
Evacuation is something winery owner John Skinner has had to deal with.
It's a constant threat.
After a weekend of record-breaking temperatures in BC, Skinner is sharing his fears about the 2024 season.
In 2020, we had a very substantial fire right to the back of our property, and that's frightening because we've got such a small snowpack now.
The average provincial snowpack for March 1st was 66% of normal.
The concerns are echoed by fire officials in the province's Okanagan Valley, where crews responded to 2 new wildfires over the weekend.
As you can see here, the snow all around us, but on the south-facing slope, it's really dry. It is drier than what it looks.
Targeted, temporary water restrictions may be needed again, but they are a last resort.
The province also announced an expansion of its use of enhanced technology to predict wildfire behavior, including infrared scanning, 5G technology, and drones.
We are the first and only standalone emergency management ministry in Canada for a province. This isn't about being scared, it's about being prepared.
Above normal temperatures across BC are expected in the coming months, and forecasters say the chance the province will see enough spring rainfall to alleviate drought conditions is possible, but unlikely. Neetu Garcha, Global News, Vancouver.
Critics of a new national security law in Hong Kong call it Hong Kong's giant leap backward. Known as Article 23, it passed unanimously by the territory's pro-Beijing parliament, eliminating freedoms that distinguish Hong Kong from China. It establishes new offenses like external interference and insurrection. Human Rights Watch says even possessing a book critical of the Chinese government can violate national security and mean years in prison. Attempts to impose similar laws in the past were met with huge pro-democracy protests. Leaders of those protests have mostly been jailed or gone into exile. A question of identity coming up, why the Innu Nation is taking the federal government to court. Canada's Auditor General is frustrated, saying little has changed in the living conditions on First Nations in this country.
After 4 audit reports, I can honestly say that I am completely discouraged that so little has changed. Our audits of federal programs to support Canada's Indigenous peoples reveal a distressing and persistent pattern of failure.
Whether in housing, policing, or safe drinking water, she says there's been little progress. Karen Hogan says the number of First Nations homes needing to be repaired or refurbished was the same in 2022 as it was in 2015. The report found funding for policing and safer communities has significantly increased since 2014, but she says $13 million in the last fiscal year went unspent. Inuit and Innu organizations joined forces today in Ottawa, calling on the federal government to scrap a controversial agreement that gives 6,000 people in South and Central Labrador Indigenous rights. Critics argue the group is not entitled to those rights. As Abigail Beeman reports, they call them settlers who are fraudulently claiming to be Inuit.
From Shahaji, Natwashish, and Nunutsiavut in Labrador, all the way to Ottawa, more than 50 Innu wanted to be at a federal court case in person with the question of identity at the core.
This is a group of settlers pretending to be an Inuit.
The Innu Nation is taking the federal government to court, wanting a 2019 agreement signed with the Nunatukavut Community Council thrown out, arguing they aren't really Inuit.
I know who I am, and I know who our people are.
We know who we are. We know where we come from.
Former Liberal MP Todd Russell heads up the Nunatukavut Community Council. More than 6,000 people claim a large area of traditional territory in Labrador that overlaps with both Innu and Inuit land. They used to call themselves the Labrador Métis Association. Russell says he's confident in their case.
We have, for the last 30 years, been presenting evidence, reports, genealogy, archaeology, anthropology, sociology.
A number of groups are backing the Innu Nation, concerned about the impact if the government recognizes the Nunatukavut as Indigenous.
We were forced to fight fraudulent groups that Canada has empowered, and this was never part of the deal.
The right to self-identify as an Indigenous person should not be used as a tool to harm the rights and interests of First Nations by taking away rights and resources intended for the original stewards of these lands.
Russell says his people need housing and food security help and wants the government to come to the table.
We have many of our communities that are hanging by their fingernails. This is why we say to the federal government, ignore the BS, ignore all of these false allegations.
The federal court hearing continues Wednesday. Abigail Beeman, Global News, Ottawa.
Surprise shutdown ahead why Manitoba could face a fuel shortage. Winnipeggers are wondering if their fuel supply could soon run out. Imperial Oil shut down a pipeline on March 15th because of what the company calls integrity concerns. It supplies Winnipeg with gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel and will be out of service for 3 months. As Marnie Blunt reports, there doesn't appear to be a clear-cut solution.
It's an abrupt halt to the flow of fuel to Winnipeg. A major Manitoba pipeline now shut down for 3 months.
Almost everything in terms of gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel is brought in by these pipelines.
Crews will be replacing a section of the pipe that runs underneath the Red River, south of Winnipeg, near the small rural community of St. Adolphe. Imperial Oil says no materials were spilled, but now the city is left with about a week's worth of supply.
I realize anything, a discussion around gas can cause people to get anxious, and we just simply don't have any reason to think anybody should. We're not. We're going to just kind of make our way through this.
Solutions include moving fuel by truck and train, but supply chain experts say those are all things that take time and money.
There's no way that they're going to be able to make it as sort of life as normal. There just simply isn't enough capacity, loading, unloading facilities, even available trucks and rail cars to be able to move everything that we're moving now. So there will be some reduction in supply.
The disruption will likely be reflected in prices at the pumps as well. Manitobans are being asked to moderate their gas consumption to avoid making a bad situation worse. Marnie Blunt, Global News, Winnipeg.
You've probably seen the latest video of Princess Kate. It's everywhere. She was spotted with her husband buying some groceries. No big deal, except because she hasn't been seen in public for a few months, it's creating quite a stir. And as Crystal Demansing reports, it's doing little to silence the roar of conspiracy theories.
Both TMZ and the Sun newspaper have published what are believed to be the first images of the Prince and Princess of Wales in public since her abdominal surgery in January.
Even that photo in the paper, they've got nothing else to write about.
The royals, especially the next generation, sells papers, increase views, and people tend to take it all in. The woman who mused about the paper not having anything better to cover also said this.
Yeah, it's nice to see her. I'm glad she's in good health.
The Princess of Wales has been out of the public eye recovering, making the images of the future king and queen at the farm shop in Windsor near their home even more desirable. An official photo released of her and the couple's 3 children last week sparked controversy. International newswire agencies determined it had been edited, violating photo policies. Kate issued an apology, but memes and conspiracy theories flooded the internet about her health, her whereabouts, even her marriage. The palace originally said the 42-year-old would not return to public duties until after Easter.
This is now just such a huge thing. I don't see how they can wait that long, which will be nearly 4 months out of the public eye.
When royals aren't seen, the stories don't stop. They can, however, become more absurd. Russian state media channels recently falsely claimed the king had died. Multiple British embassies, including Ukraine's, issued statements saying the report was fake. Being part of the royal family comes with clear perks, but privacy isn't one of them. Crystal Demansing, Global News, London.
And that's Global National for this Tuesday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is Jasper, Alberta. We'd love to see your Canada. Please email it to viewers@globalnational.com. And thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching and privilege of your time. This is Amir Shakil 5858. I am Amir Goodman. Have a good life.